Hello, kind people. This is Peter Svidler doing my last recap for Tata Steel Chess 2019. Wijk tournament is now at an end, and there can only really be one choice for game of the day for the last round, regardless of what happened in that round. I think the clash for the first place was always going to be the pick. Anish Giri played white in the last round against Magnus Carlsen, with Anish having a very simple equation in front of him: win and become the winner of Wijk 2019. Any other result, he was very likely to be in clear second place, not even shared. So a bit of a free roll in those terms. But we also had a discussion prior to the round starting with Jan about how you would feel in his spot about going all out for a win. And Jan made a very valid point, I think, that in terms of the tournament result, maybe the loss wouldn't matter very much. And in that respect, Anish felt quite safe. But losing to Magnus is something I don't think he wants to do at all. I think we can all anticipate many, many more games between them in the future. Anish is definitely one of the people who could end up challenging Magnus for the title over the years to come, and their personal score, much more than the situation in the tournament, is something I think that Anish rightly cares about. So there was always going to be a mixture of an approach from Anish to this game. So let's have a look what happened. Anish opened with 1e4. Obviously, you can play a great many things against Magnus, but his repertoire against 1e4 these days is quite well set. In particular, after the match against Caruana, you can more or less pinpoint what will happen. And these positions are arguably no reason not to play 1e4 in against. And 1e4 is what Anish chooses. c5, knight f3, knight c6, no bishop b5 silliness today. Takes, knight f6, knight c3, e5, knight db5, d6. We have a proper Sveshnikov on our hands, and here is an interesting first turning point. Anish could have played knight d5 here, aiming for extremely sharp positions arising after both knight e7 and knight b8. And obviously he has done some work in these positions over the years, and also because of his work as sort of a annotator-in-chief these days for the New in Chess magazine, he definitely has done a decent amount of work looking at this, just preparing his report on the World Championship match for that venerable publication. But he opts for bishop g5 here, a6, knight a3, b5, and knight d5, not bishop takes f6. And at this point, I felt that our hopes for a sharp fight in this game were greatly diminished, because these positions, as I mentioned, are very sharp. And if you get here, these lines, they are a lot more forced in many cases than the 95 lines, but they also could lead to some really crazy positions. But knight d5, bishop e7, which is incidentally also something that Timur Rajabov played against Magnus in round 11, is kind of rock solid if White wants it to be. And at that point in particular, the narrative of not really going all out for a win today and just feeling quite okay with +4 second place, rating gain, status gain to a degree, because he did play an excellent tournament, was sort of foremost in Anish's mind. And I think that, frankly, is a bit unfair. He just had an idea here and felt this was a good shot. Takes, c3, bishop g5, knight c2, rook b8. Against Rajabov, Magnus chose a slightly different move order. He played castles, knight c2, rook b8, allowing the move h2, h4, which sometimes leads to very, very crazy positions. But today he goes bishop g5, knight c2, rook b8. This aims to stop both h4 and the lines with a4, because black gets immediate counterplay along the b file. Of course, there's a ton of theory connected, for instance, with this try for white. But obviously Magnus has done a ton of work, Magnus and his team has done a ton of work preparing for Fabiano in all kinds of Sveshnikovs, so I don't think he would have been too surprised to see this position on the board. Anish instead goes bishop e2, and after castles, and king h8, we are back in Rajabov-Carlsen territory, and Timur made a very, very solid looking but somewhat empty move a2, a3 in this position, and the game was eventually drawn because Magnus couldn't really find a way to open the position up to his advantage, and Timur, frankly, looked like he was perfectly fine just setting something ultra solid on the board and asking Magnus the question if he wants to try and do something maybe to the detriment of his position, which the answer on the day was no. Instead of all this, Anish plays bishop g4, which is a reasonably rare move. The main move in this position, I believe, is queen d3. And after bishop g4, we were very much discussing during the live show whether what is White's plan against the most obvious move in the position, which is bishop e6. Of course, Black doesn't want to allow the trade of these bishops without changing the structure at least a little bit. Something like takes would immediately give White arguably close to a winning advantage because of just how fantastic this knight on d5 is. Maybe winning is slightly strong, but you never ever do this. And after bishop e6 there are some games. The move seems to be standing quite well in terms of stats, and it is very, very natural. But the move that Magnus made quite quickly here is bishop b7, which once again, I'm not entirely convinced in my data here, but I think it's even technically a novelty. Keeping the bishops on the board and aiming to play, I guess in some order, g6, maybe the knight goes to e7 to trade one knight on d5, and then Black just plays a quiet game saying that he has enough control over this position not to worry too much. And normally play would have continued something along the lines of, let's say, queen d3. The machine likes playing g6 here, although knight e7 is obviously a very valid move even here. Let's say g6, rook a d1, knight e7, White probably takes. And here both, let's say, bishop takes e7, knight e3, let's say king g7, knight d5, bishop g5, g3, h5, bishop h3. I looked at this position, and once again, I don't trust myself very much with evaluations of Sveshnikov positions because I'm not a huge specialist on of that opening, and I feel like I need to look at them some more and more recently to establish what I think about this. But the machine says this is completely equal, and as a matter of fact, isn't really even very much worried about something like takes, and then bishop e7 back. And the same applies to queen takes e7 on move 18, which I think is maybe slightly more solid. Knight b4, we include h5, bishop h3, because this is always useful. Because the pawn on e4 is hanging, you can even play king g7 for now. And eventually Black does go rook fd8, and after knight d5, of course White can include a3, but another typical idea that the machine seems to think is completely fine here is takes. Important, I think, to play b4, and after c4, queen c7. It's not really very much afraid for its life here. Although these positions, I think, sometimes end up being slightly better for White. They normally appear on the board when White plays c4 before knight c2, and here you can get sometimes structures very reminiscent of this from this variation. You often, well, not often, but reasonably regularly, you get positions like this, and they're not horrible for Black, but they could end up favoring White a little bit. But Anish was in a different kind of mood. He didn't really like quiet moves like queen d3 here, and he played knight cb4 straight away. And this sharpens the position up quite significantly, because after knight takes b4, already you have a choice. You can take with the knight, which actually isn't stupid at all, and I think maybe you can even make an argument that this is a slightly safer choice. And here Black has once again a dilemma. You can play this position, and here Black has a number of options. I wanted to check if d6, d5 is possible, because this is the move I would like to make the most. f3, bishop g6 is quite bad, because then White ends up with this really stupid bishop somewhere on h3, and Black will have tremendous play for this one pawn on d5. But after queen e2, Black can choose between playing bishop e7 and then taking on b4, and computer suggests this is equal. because white gets decent play in the center. There's sometimes some f4 breaks, so black doesn't end up with the pawn pair in the center. Or you can go sort of all out here, play rook h6, rook a d1, f5, bishop f3, you take, you play d4, with the intention of going cd4, e4, I'm pretty sure. And try to give some kind of a mate on the king side. But this ends up also leading to some equalities according to the machine, because white should be able to make sure he doesn't get mated, but black does get enough counterplay after, for instance, a possible bishop queen e2, bishop e7, queen takes b5, bishop d6. Black gets a ton of play on the king side here, but it's not more than a perpetual, eventually. Instead of all this, and also I want to mention that after knight takes b4, black can just play g6, also a very solid move, with the intention of replying to something like queen d3 with a5, knight d5, f5, using the obvious fact that here white will lose a piece. And after bishop f3, black can play a move like queen c8, also a very typical maneuver here, aiming for a very good square on c5. Or after rook a d1, both queen c5, which is fine, and also the maneuver bishop c6, followed by queen b7, queen a7. White's position is still extremely solid, because it's very difficult for black to get anywhere after, let's say, something like rook fe1, queen b7, a3. You can play queen a7, hoping for some play along the f-file. But after queen e2, I think we still have a position of what is supposed to be called dynamic equality, although I guess black is will find it slightly easier to find useful moves. You can go for, let's say, rook f7, rook bf8 here with some ideas on the king side. But the evaluation resolutely stays at 0-0-0 in all these positions. Anish, instead of all that, took with the pawn. Black played g6. And here already, I think it's quite clear that it's easier to play with black, because the bishop on g5 controls the c1 square very, very solidly. Whereas black, if black achieves f7, f5 here, will actually get access to the c-file. And in particular, the maneuver rook c8, c4 is quite dangerous, because after white took on b4 with the pawn, black has this idea of rook c8, c4, and in particular rook c8, c4, d4, which could be quite threatening. And play could continue something along the lines of, a4 is what Anish played. But he could have played something like queen d3, f5, bishop f3, rook c8. And here white can in some order play a3, rook c4, and rook d1. It's very important to play rook d1 here, because otherwise rook d4 would be more or less crushing. But here white is finally prepared to do something like, white's next move most likely is knight d5, c3, aiming to start simplifying and also putting pressure on the d6 pawn, creating a positional idea of taking ef and trading the bishops. And very, very importantly, after rook d4, queen c2, black does not force white to take on d5 immediately. Of course, you first include rook takes d4, ed, and ed. It's very, very important, precisely because of that, to play rook d1, because if you imagine this structure is, I would say, close to hopeless for white, because he very often just gets overrun on the king side. The bishop gets transferred over to e5, and then black, because of just how better his bishop is, gets an overwhelming initiative on the king side. And Anish, perhaps understanding all that, and also, I guess, because he wanted to sharpen the game up as much as possible, he played a4 here, which is a useful move in general. You want to create, whoops, that's not how rooks move. You want to create some work for the rook on a1. You want to weaken the pawn on b5 by taking. But black has a very concrete reply here: ba4, rook a4, and bishop c6. And this puts white in front of puts a very difficult question in front of white here. I think in particular in terms of the tournament situation, because I have a feeling Anish's choice was at least in part dictated by him needing to win. Because I think the most obvious move in the position is rook takes a6, despite the fact that white loses the exchange. You can play bishop b5, let's say bishop e2, bishop a6, and The computer still prefers this slightly for black because in particular it really likes the queen d7 idea with the intention of playing bishop d8 and bishop b6, hoping to get it all the way to d4. But white can play bishop c4, bishop d8, simply b5. And if black lands the bishop on b6, white in most cases just takes it, plays b3, and says this bishop is now so strong and the pawn on b5 is so completely unassailable that I'm not even worse. And the same applies to the position after b5, f5. Let's say ef, queen f5, queen e2, bishop b6, takes, and bishop d5. This is very similar to what I just discussed. And even the machine doesn't believe that black is better here because of this setup. It's very, very solid. But after rook takes a6, black can also just take on d5, take on b4, and after rook d6 there is one last precise move, queen e8. And combined threats of rook takes b2 and rook d4 mean that black wins the pawn back more or less instantly, and more or less never loses after that. I think the position is extremely dry and also very, very equal. And if you compare, let's say, this position with the position that Anish decided to get in the game, I think the only reason that I can find, I could be wrong on this, but the only reason I could find for choosing what Anish played instead of this is the existence of the move bishop takes d5, which just simplifies and makes a draw. And also, if you wanted to make a more solid draw without ever offering black any kind of an exchange sacrifice, you can play rook a5 here, takes, queen takes, rook takes b4, and rook takes a6. And here black arguably is slightly better after something like rook d4, queen c6, d5, bishop f3, takes, and king g7. But you very rarely actually win these positions. Obviously some care is required because the b-pawn is more of a weakness than a strength, and black has very decent dark squared control. But you at some point start trading pieces, and I think in most cases white makes a draw here. But instead of all that, after bishop c6, Anish made a very risky move, bishop e2, which after bishop takes a4, queen takes a4, I think arguably should have led to very unpleasant, maybe even bad positions for him. Although probably not as bad as we thought during the game. And the move black is supposed to make here, unsurprisingly, is a6, a5, because this is the one major difference between the lines we were just discussing and the position we have on the board. Black can actually preserve this pawn. ba, rook b2, bishop b3, bishop d3, and for instance rook queen b8 with a very simple idea of queen b3, but also leaving the c file for the other rook, is extremely bad for white. This just does not work on any level. Black is close to winning here. So you have to play b5. And here black has a choice. You can go f5, which is quite natural, take with the rook, go back to f8. And if white goes g3, h4, which I think is quite natural here, hoping to create something along this file. One decent plan for black here is to go bishop d2 and simply bishop b4. And white has a very tough choice of either allowing bishop c5, which is not great because this will be a very, very strong light piece, or taking twice, allowing d6, d5. And once again, white is not hopeless here because he has a decent passed pawn on b5 and a pawn for the exchange in general. But black is, of course, quite seriously ahead. And perhaps an even stronger move is, to, for the time being, just to play queen c8, aiming to put it on c5 in most cases. Also f5, ef, queen takes f5 becomes a topic of discussion. And importantly, if white takes on a5, he is more or less completely lost after queen c2. And after b3, black has once again a choice between, let's say, f5, ef, and here both queen takes f5 and queen c5, which is also very decent. And there is also a move queen c2, which surprisingly to my eyes more or less forces white to exchange the e4 pawn for the a5 pawn. But also, to my great surprise, this setup is so solid that after something like this, the computer evaluates black's advantage as only 0.90 or thereabouts, which I thought was incredibly low. I thought, okay, this is a full exchange. There's always an option of playing rook takes b5 in these positions. So my sort of eye test analysis here would be black has to be close to winning. But the machine disagrees and says that yes, black is obviously doing exceedingly well, but not really winning by any stretch. Instead of that, Magnus played f5, and after ef rook takes f5, Anish committed a couple of inaccuracies. The second one more important than the first. First of all, the machine insists that you should take on a6 immediately. There's really no reason for you to chase the rook away from f5. I'm pretty sure Anish was worried about e5, e4 here, but after e4, bishop c4, machine says, don't fret, you're actually almost out of the woods now. The queen will return, well, not the rook, the queen will return. White once again has this b3, b5 setup to make sure that nothing ever touches his light squared pieces, and e4, e3 never really materializes. And after bishop takes a6, the machine, in order to suggest that white is still in trouble, makes an incredibly weird move, queen d8, g8, which I, to this very moment, don't really understand why this is necessary. I guess the best explanation is the queen doesn't have very many useful squares, and more than anything, black wants to play bishop d8 and bishop b6. So queen g8, no matter how weird it looks, is just a way to free up the d8 square with the tempo. Let's say bishop c4, queen g7, queen c2, bishop d8. And once again, it is black who is, if anyone, who is slightly better here. But we have seen positions like this before, and they really aren't horrible for white at all. Instead, Anish goes bishop d3, rook f8, and here he makes a mistake which I think against best play, in particular against the machine, would probably have cost him the game. He takes on a6 with the queen. It looks very logical because, well, clearly the bishop belongs on d3, you want to play bishop b4, return the queen to e2 and so on. But you should still take with the bishop, because the biggest threat black actually has here is bishop d2, and this is played by Magnus instantly. And the point is not just that we are attacking the d2 pawn, we're also now we have some ideas of queen h4 followed by queen d4. For instance, after b5, I think bishop a5 is strong, but I suspect that queen h4 might also be quite decent. But in particular, I think bishop a5 followed by bishop b6, as often is the case in these positions, is very, very strong. And clearly, Anish didn't like it either, because he played queen c4. And after queen c4, Magnus missed what computers insist is almost a win, frankly. But once again, not a sequence of moves that, for instance, occurred to me during the live show. So it really is not much of a surprise that this was missed. Rook c8 you consider, but after queen e4, to figure out that rook c1 is more or less winning, not because we need to trade the rook or anything, but because once again, we are trying to achieve, well, not to e4, to d4. We're trying to get the bishop from d2 to d4 in the fastest way possible. And for instance, the position after takes b3, bishop b2, the computer already assesses as -3, because after bishop d4, I mean, probably it wouldn't have been so horrible if we could in this position play king g2 and f3 immediately. But because we're not in time, the blockade in the center will have to be removed to just preserve the pawn on f2 alive. And then once the d-pawn starts running, you just die. So the machine says you have to play b5. And here it goes queen a8, g3, and queen a2. And basically, white's position just collapses under the threat of this invasion along the queen side. And yeah, this position is really, really bad for white. I think, once again, against the computer, you probably just lose this. Although, I mean, obviously, and this doesn't need to be restated, a difficult maneuver to find. Not easy at all. And instead of that, Magnus played queen c8. But then again, before we sort of pile on and say that a win was missed, you have to remember that Magnus these days, he likes winning games, and of course he also knows that he will be playing Anish for a while. But queen c8 is a very solid move, which actually requires careful defense from white. But Magnus was not really obliged to win this game. I think he was perfectly fine pushing, but if Anish defends correctly, he was also perfectly fine just taking a draw and securing the first place in the tournament. And after queen c8, I think Anish's decision is quite smart, because you can play b5 here, and the position after takes, bishop a5, let's say g3, bishop b6 and king g2, is not that horrible, frankly. But you still will have to hold it for a while. Black gets bishop, let's say bishop d4, b3, there's some play along the a file. You can more or less never play b6 because it will get picked up. Let's say b6 rook b8 here just loses the b pawn. So the rook becomes active, and you have to carefully defend this position for a while with somewhat unclear prospects. Although my suspicion is it's closer to a draw than to a black victory. But the move that Anish made on queen e4 is extremely likely to provoke exactly the reaction that happened in the game. Bishop takes b4. Black can still switch to what we keep on discussing, queen b7, b5, bishop a5. And here I just wanted to check some very, very human ideas. I played g3, king g2. Black plays bishop d4. And here the machine dislikes this idea and thinks it's wrong. But I just wanted to check what it will say if I force it to play h4, bishop takes b2, h5, gh, and rook h1. And after a while, it starts saying this is close to equality, and also the position just becomes very sharp. And you can see this going slightly sideways for black, because if you give me one more tempo to play rook takes h5 here, I more or less win. So I think it was always very likely that Magnus would ensure simplifications here by taking on b4, knight takes, rook f4, queen c6, rook fb4, queen takes d6. And in this position, black cannot preserve the e5 pawn at all, because after queen e8, white has the immediate queen f6 check, king g8, and simply, for instance, b2, b3, and bishop c4 check will happen on the next move. So this is not very attractive for black. And in the game, Magnus played queen f8, Anish played queen takes e5 and just offered a draw. In the position after queen g7, of course he can play on for another number of hours with black, but your winning chances objectively aren't very high. With the rooks traded off, it's a well-known theoretical draw, 3 against 2 with the light-squared bishop on one side. With 2 rooks on the board, once again, it's possible to make an argument that there is more torture involved. But I think you don't win this anyway, and Magnus, as is the norm I think these days, just takes the tournament win and says, yeah, fine, let's not waste each other's time too long. So with that game and the other results, the final cross table of the 2019 Wijk tournament looks like this. As you can see, Magnus scores the same +5 that he scored last time. But last time he was caught up and he tied with Anish Giri on +5. This year Anish falls slightly short, scoring only +4, and I'm using huge air quotes saying only +4. That's a fantastic result, in particular if you consider that Anish only scored 50% with white and won 4 black games in this tournament. Then we have 3 people on +2, Jan Nepomniachtchi, who started really well and then had a very, very uneven end to the tournament. A sequence of 4 decisive games, 2 of which he won and 2 lost. Vishy Anand, who had a very solid tournament, apart from that one painful loss against Magnus. And Ding Liren, who also won 2 games really early and then made quite a number of draws in a row, actually. I think his last win in this tournament came around round 4. I don't want to check right now. Vidit finishes on +1, could have scored more points. In general, I think played really, really well. And people on 50% will feel exactly how that feels, some positives, some negatives. And at the bottom there we have Shahryar Mamedyarov scoring -3, which is obviously very, very bad for him. And another thing that we kept on being a topic of discussion for the entire tournament, Vladimir Kramnik having a really, really poor tournament. He almost recovered to a degree, winning 2 nice games in rounds 11 and 12, but today he once again did something extremely inexplicable to my eyes. Basically refusing what is effectively a draw offer from Sam Shankland around move 50 in their very complicated game, in which I think he first had a large advantage out of the opening and then was close to losing in the middle game before stabilizing. And then he had a very easy 2-move draw, which he did not miss. He just decided not to make it. And instead he opted to play a position which can never ever be better for him, which is really something I cannot understand, and ended up losing it, sending him back to -4 and a tie for the last place with Jordan van Foreest, who also lost today, but should still consider this tournament, I think, a very, very valuable way to gain experience, and I'm sure this is not going to be his last Wijk. But this is my last Wijk video. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I once again want to thank all of you for watching these videos and for joining us during the live shows. It has been a very, very pleasant and interesting tournament to cover, and as usual I really enjoyed working with Jan Gustafsson, my established partner in crime for these shows. I hope to have more of these in the future, but for now I bid you adieu, and thanks for watching. This has been Peter Svidler for Chess24.